The American Election Guide by God Jehovah. Exodus 18, verses 20 through 21 is God's plan for government and electing people to govern. Verse 20 says, "Then teach them the statutes and the laws, and make known to them the way in which they are to walk, and the work they are to do. Furthermore, you shall select," now that's you shall select, "out of all the people, able men who fear God, men of truth, those who hate dishonest gain, and you shall place these over them," the people, "as leaders of thousands, leaders of hundreds, leaders of 50s, and leaders of 10s. Let them judge the people at all times, and let it be that every major dispute that they will bring to you, but every minor dispute they will themselves will judge." This is God's plan. We Christians have failed God and country as Judeo-Christians by ignoring His way. So America will change only if and when we change our hearts to obey step-by-step instructions in priority order. God's way for America. Let's look at these. Number one, teach the statutes and laws. All adults and children must know them. Now, let's drop anchor here a second. How can we know our laws if we don't study them? Do we not know our historic documents? Do we know the constitutions, not only of the United States Constitution, but how about our own state constitution? Now, how could we expect our children and precious grandchildren to know them if we don't know them as adults when we're too busy to take the time to study and learn? That was point number one, and we haven't started there, but we must, and we must do it now. There's no more time for excuses. America must have God now. America must bless God and do what He tells us to do. His election guide is clear. Now let's go to point two. Make known how God's people are to live and work. Now let's stop here a second. Make known how God's people are to live and work. Well, Christians must vote. If you are a Judeo-Christian and you have the blessings of America and you don't vote, you're voting by default for those who are not God's people to rule over you and your precious grandchildren. There's no excuse not to vote and to vote according to God's election guide. If God's people don't know how they're supposed to live and work, America's doomed to fail. That is not His plan. Point three, you select. Now, that's very important. The people select, not be appointed by a political party boss, not take the word for a political party that vote for them because they're part of our party when you don't know anything about them. You didn't select them. You acted like a dumb sheep whose master tells you what to do and where to go and where to eat and where not to. That's not selecting, you selecting. That's being a dumb sheep. And you know what? Thank God we can repent and change that. And when we do, we will change America. when we start letting God tell us what to do instead of political party bosses, a small number of people with big money and power and influence, they're not going to tell me how to select. I'm going to study. I'm going to know how we're supposed to live and work. And then I'm going to elect our government accordingly. I'm going to vote for able men. Now, what does that mean? People who are proven capable and able to do the job. Now, how in America can we expect men and women who we elect to office because of their looks, because they're black or not black or Hispanic, or we look at every other thing other than are they able and capable to do the job? What have they proven in their past? What is the track record that would prove that they're able and capable to do the job? Now, if they don't have a history of success in governing, then why do we elect people? Because we won't change. We don't like the way things are, we just won't change. Or we want to put somebody in there that looks like us, our color, because I think he'll take care of our kind. That's not God's way. Are we so selfish as to select men and women who are totally not qualified and not capable of doing the job for any reason in direct opposition to God's election guide? Next point, men and women who fear God. Now, how do we define that? How do we know? Everybody claims to love Jesus whenever the time comes for elections. Have you noticed that? Everybody, they just love Jesus. They just turn Christian, and their speech changes, and whenever the cameras are rolling, they're just as Christian as can be. But that's not the way you determine who is able and capable, and men and women who fear God. The way you determine that is to examine them and their lives. Do they live humble lives? Do they have humble hearts? Have they voted or acted by God's standards? If they have, then you have able men. And you have men and women that God wants to be put in government over His people. Next point is men of truth. Have we not had enough in America of the lies and deceit and the outrageous finger pointing of one political party to another political party, and they blame everybody else? But our elected officials in Washington have a 14% approval rating because they don't act by God's standards. They're not men and women of honor and virtue. But we keep electing them anyway. We know it, but they're our people. I know that. I know that one. No, I can call him. They know my name. So what? If they don't have honor and virtue by God's standards, it doesn't matter if we know them, if we like them, or we just think they're good looking, or they talk a good game. We've got to decide. We've got to discern. We've got to study and know the law, know what we should be doing by God's standards, by His election guide. We've had enough of men and women in our elected offices who just don't display and live the honor and virtue code by God's standards. That is our number one problem in America. And as long as we keep electing people who do not have the honor and virtue by God's standards, what do we expect to come out of our government? Except anti-God, evil and vile things that God doesn't want for us. He gave us America as a gift. And now we don't even take the time to make sure we're sending men and women of truth, honor, and virtue. by God's standards alone, not our selfish interests. Next point, hate dishonest gain. That means not craving power, control, or a career. Our servant leaders are supposed to be servant leaders that don't crave the power and control. Oh, they want a career as a politician. That is your first clue as to the humility and the honor and virtue of the people you vote for. If they've been up there a long time and they just want to go back and back and back and back and back, why? Why do they want that power and control? Is that for your interests or for their interests? And the point 4, you elect only by God's standards. Now again, not any political party's choice for leaders of thousands, which amounts to the federal government, leaders of hundreds, which amounts to state government, leaders of 50s, which amounts to our county government, and leaders of 10s, which is our local government. Now that is God's system in our U.S. Constitution, Article 1, Section 8, Amendments 9 and Amendments 10. And that, my friend, is God Jehovah's election guide for us to self-govern under God Jehovah. We do it at our blessing, and we ignore it and disobey it at our peril. Now, how's that worked out for us so far by ignoring and disobeying God? We need to vet every candidate by God's 11 standards. God Jehovah only, that's number 1. If they advocate for any other false gods, or they are ashamed of God in public, that is our first standard, and we need to write them off the list. They cannot serve us and serve God Jehovah if they're ashamed of Him publicly and by their actions, not by their lip service, but by their actions. Now, the next standard is shalt not steal. Okay, now if people we elect are willing to steal from us and from our children and from our precious grandchildren, now how are they stealing from us? Do they vote to raise the debt ceiling? Do they vote for spending in excess of what we take in? That's stealing from our children and grandchildren, because they're going to have to pay our debt. They're stealing because they want to make themselves look good, or they don't have the courage to stand up and say, no, we're not going to steal from the people in my state, not going to steal from the people in my state's children or grandchildren. I'm not going to vote to raise the debt ceiling. In fact, I'm not going to vote for any budget that's not balanced. I'm not going to vote for any budget that doesn't vote to cut this debt that we've already laid upon our children and grandchildren. Why is there no discussion ever of lowering the debt limit, cutting the debt ceiling, having a percentage of our annual budget, a federal budget? Why is that percentage to pay the debt back so that we get back to zero? Have you ever heard discussion that we need to get our debt back to zero? Why? Because they don't understand thou shalt not steal. Now, Louis, I understand that you're a little bit radical here. And I understand that, I understand that you're trying to do what's right. But now, deficit spending is not all that bad. Managed debt is not that bad. Actually, it's stealing. So let me just tell you right here, it's stealing, and I'll tell you why. If we're having to borrow money and paying interest to somebody for that money, or we are printing paper and calling it money. Whatever we print makes the money in my wallet right now worth less. You see, prices don't go up. Our dollar is worth less and buys less. So, our worthless dollar is reflected in the rising prices constantly. It's called an inflation tax, because the more you create and print money out of paper, it makes the total amount of paper that's in existence worth less than it was. That is stealing. Now, when we stop and start electing people by God's election guide who refuse to steal, we'll change America. Now, those 2 points alone are pretty powerful. But how about shalt not allow murder, one of God's commandments? Are we allowing murder in our nation? Well, if we believe in God Jehovah of the Holy Bible, he says that he knew us before we were knit together in our mother's wombs. He knew us before conception. At the moment of conception, when he breathed in his spirit to allow a new creation, at that moment, even biological science proves there is a new living creature, because what's being formed there is not the mother, and it's not the father. It's a separate being that begins to form itself. And to take God's creation and murder a separate being that he says he knew before we were knit together in our mother's wombs. And we allow that precious gift from God and God's creation to be murdered. Over 55 million of them since 1970s. If we allow that murder, we can't be a nation that's blessed under God Jehovah. How about honors biblical marriage? How does the Bible describe marriage? That is what we must elect as people. And I'm talking about people that will appoint judges in our federal courts and make sure that those federal judges are God Jehovah people. If not, we get what we ask for. We get what we elect. But I've got to vote for this political party because they've been good to me economically, and they've been better. They've taken care of me. Is that what God's election guide says? No. Honesty, integrity, personal enterprise. What have they done personally to make a living? And how did they succeed at that? Did they succeed in personal enterprise to make a living for themselves and their families? And how did they go about doing that? Was it honorable work? Was it successful? Did it help other people? Personal enterprise. How about personal responsibility? That's his stated mission for us to vet a candidate. Do they accept personal responsibility, or do they want to blame the government or blame the political party or blame anything in the past that happened 200 years ago for their problems in life? That's not accepting personal responsibility. Personal responsibility is not your past. It's your present and your future. And in America, we can make it whatever we want to be. It's whatever we put our mind to. Now, people that make excuses that it's somebody else's fault, they've oppressed us, they've kept us down, well, then you've been kept down by your choices, not by anybody else in America. The opportunity is there. It's our choices. A person that must understand the rule of law. and understand that it's God's law first in order to implement any other law of man. All law of man must be submitted to God Jehovah. Do your candidates do that? Or do they expect to pick and choose which law that they want to enforce? Selective enforcement as they choose. That's not doing their sworn duty. That's disobeying God to the maximum extent. We have enough laws on the book if we enforce the laws that we have. They ought to be people of free enterprise, where they don't have restrictions and favors for one race, color, ethnic group, or any other reason. Enterprise is the opportunity to achieve. And the federal government has no business in regulating and strangling and overseeing our free enterprise. Limited government is the other thing that we should vet candidates for. You see, limited government is in God's election guide. There's a certain amount of things, minor things and major things to be handled by the people we elect, and the major things by the president, if you want to look at it that way. But the people we elect must not create their own kingdom by increasing their government at the peril of the people losing our lives, our liberties, and our pursuit of happiness. Now, remember what I said here, that thou shalt not steal is the number one thing to vet a candidate by, other than are they God Jehovah people? If they're not, we have a problem, and we're never going to be a God Jehovah country again. The second point is stealing by causing debt paid by our grandchildren, the murder of the unborn or elderly particularly. These are God's clear, self-governing and election guide orders for us and instructions by God Jehovah of the Holy Bible. Now, in America, we have both been extremely blessed because our founding fathers actually followed that election guide, and our citizens actually followed that election guide in the beginning of America. And we elected godly men and women. We elected people of great honor and integrity who bowed the knee to God Jehovah, who publicly announced no sovereign but God and no king but Jesus as their battle cry, not only of the war generals in the Revolutionary War, but also John Adams. We had our leaders, our founding fathers, who were publicly advocates of God Jehovah and God Jehovah only. No other God, no other false God, God Jehovah only. Now, do we want to be a country that is blessed by God? If we want God bless America, then we need to be America bless God. This election guide tells us how to elect candidates that are going to be God Jehovah guided and led. And it tells us how we are to be self-governing. We, the people, have to study, know what people stand for that we're electing, and not let anybody else tell us how to vote. Go in and pull a political party lever. That is not biblical, and I rebuke it publicly. Here and now. What will you do? Will you become a Christian patriot? Or continue how you're doing now and not be involved, not even vote? 48 million Americans in the 2000s, year 2000s, don't vote. 48 million. 35 million Catholics don't vote. So by default, we're rebuking God Jehovah and allowing the people that are not God Jehovah believers to be elected and rule this country. We ought to be ashamed of ourselves. Here's the election guide. Now, what are you going to do about it?